When you hang tinsel on your Christmas tree this year, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries. But have you ever wondered why? Why these thin strands of silver? Why do we drape them carefully over branches, letting them catch the light, creating that magical shimmer that seems to capture the very essence of Christmas magic? The answer lies in a story that most people have never heard. A story about a poor widow, a bare tree, and an act of kindness that changed Christmas forever. A story about spiders. Yes, spiders. Those creatures we spend most of the year trying to keep out of our homes. Those eight-legged weavers that spin their webs in corners and under eaves. In the deep folklore of Eastern Europe, spiders weren't pests to be swept away. They were weavers of fortune, bringers of blessings. And on one particular Christmas Eve, they became the bearers of a miracle that would transform a single family's sorrow into a tradition celebrated across the world. This is the legend of the Christmas spider. And once you know it, you'll never look at tinsel the same way again. You'll see in those silver strands not just decoration, but the echo of an old story about poverty and kindness, about making do with what you have, about finding beauty in the most unexpected places, and about how sometimes the smallest creatures can bring the greatest gifts. Tonight, we journey into the heart of a forgotten Christmas tale, one that deserves to be remembered and retold, especially now, especially in these times when we need to be reminded that miracles often come in the humblest forms, that generosity costs nothing but means everything, and that the true spirit of Christmas has nothing to do with how much we spend and everything to do with how much we give of ourselves. This is a story that grandmothers used to tell their grandchildren in villages across Ukraine, Poland, and Germany. A story that survived wars and migrations, depressions and displacements. A story that quietly shaped one of our most beloved Christmas traditions without most people ever knowing its origin. So settle in, let the world outside grow quiet, and let me tell you about a cold Christmas Eve long ago, about a poor family and a pine tree, about creatures that worked through the night while humans slept, and about a morning that dawned silver and shimmering with unexpected grace. To understand the Christmas spider legend, we must first understand the world that gave birth to it. We're speaking of Eastern Europe in centuries past, a region of deep forests and harsh winters, of small villages clustered together for warmth and protection, of people whose lives were intimately connected to the rhythms of nature and the turning of seasons. In these communities, particularly in what we now know as Ukraine, Poland, and parts of Germany and the Czech lands, folklore wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven into everything. The stories people told weren't just entertainment. They were ways of understanding the world, of passing down wisdom, of making sense of the inexplicable, and of maintaining hope during the darkest times. Winter in these regions was not the mild, manageable season we might experience in more temperate climates. It was brutal, relentless, a test of endurance that lasted for months. The days shortened until there were barely a few hours of weak sunlight. The cold was bone deep, penetrating through the thickest walls of the wooden cottages that dotted the countryside. Food stores had to last from harvest to spring, and there was always the fear that supplies might run out before the thaw came. In such an environment, Christmas took on a significance that went beyond religious observance. It was a light in the darkness, quite literally. It came at the winter solstice, at the point when the days began, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen again. It was a promise that winter would not last forever, that spring would return, that life would renew itself. The traditions surrounding Christmas in these cultures were designed to reinforce this hope, to create warmth and light and community during the coldest, darkest time of year. Now, spiders occupied an interesting place in Eastern European folklore. Unlike in many Western European traditions where spiders were sometimes associated with witchcraft or seen as simple pests, in the Slavic and Germanic folk traditions of the East, spiders held a more nuanced position. They were weavers, and weaving was sacred. They created intricate patterns from nothing but their own bodies, spinning beauty out of thin air. This was seen as almost magical, a kind of creation that mirrored the divine. There were folk beliefs that spiders brought good fortune. Finding a spider in your home, particularly in certain contexts, was considered lucky. Some traditions held that killing a spider brought bad luck, that these creatures were under special protection. In Ukrainian folklore specifically, there was a belief that spiders could predict the weather, that the height and placement of their webs could tell you what kind of winter lay ahead, whether the harvest would be good or poor. Spiders were also associated with industry and perseverance. They worked tirelessly, often at night when humans slept. If their webs were destroyed, they would simply begin again, rebuilding with the same patience and dedication. For people whose lives required constant hard work, whose survival depended on never giving up no matter how difficult circumstances became, the spider was a creature worthy of respect. The tradition of bringing an evergreen tree into the home during winter was ancient in these regions, predating Christianity by centuries. The evergreen was a symbol of life persisting through death, of green remaining when everything else had turned brown and gray. When Christianity came to these lands, the evergreen became associated with Christmas, but it retained its older symbolic meanings. It was a promise, a reminder, a piece of living nature brought into the home during the deadest part of the year. Different regions had different traditions about decorating these trees. Some used apples and nuts, symbols of abundance and wishes for good harvest. Some used candles, bringing light into the darkness. Some used simple paper ornaments that families would make together during the long winter evenings. But the decorations were often simple, sometimes heartbreakingly so, because these were not, for the most part, wealthy communities. These were people who knew what it meant to have little, to make do, to find beauty in simplicity. Christmas in these villages was a community affair. Families would gather for meals that represented the best they could offer, sharing what they had. There would be singing, traditional carols that had been passed down through generations. There would be storytelling, the elders passing on the old tales to the children. And there would be church services, long and elaborate, filled with ceremony and incense, and the ancient words that connected these people to something larger than their individual struggles. But even within the community, there were always those who had less than others. The widows whose husbands had died young, leaving them to raise children alone. The families where illness had struck, where the breadwinner couldn't work, where circumstances had conspired to push them to the margins. In tight-knit communities, these families were not forgotten, but neither could their neighbors always provide everything they needed. Everyone was struggling to some degree. Everyone was trying to survive the winter. And it's from this context, from this world of harsh winters and tight communities, of deep folklore and persistent poverty, of evergreen trees and industrious spiders, that our story emerges. A story that speaks to the universal human experiences of want and hope, of making do with very little, of finding that sometimes, somehow, when we least expect it, grace arrives to transform our circumstances in ways we could never have imagined. Once upon a time, in a small village that existed somewhere and everywhere, in a time that was both specific and eternal, there lived a widow. Her name has been lost to history, or perhaps it was never recorded, because she was the sort of person who passes through life quietly, noticed by few, remembered by fewer. But on one particular Christmas Eve, she became the center of a story that would be told and retold for centuries to come. She was poor, this widow. Not the romantic poverty of fairy tales, but the grinding, exhausting poverty that wore a person down, that aged them before their time, that made every day a calculation of how to stretch meager resources to cover impossible needs. Her husband had died some years before, perhaps in an accident, perhaps from illness. The specifics don't matter because the result was the same. She was alone with her children, trying to be both mother and father, trying to provide and protect and somehow maintain hope when circumstances offered precious little reason for it. She worked, of course. She took in washing when she could get it. She did mending for those who had clothes fine enough to be worth mending. She cleaned houses for families who could afford to pay someone else to do their cleaning. She gathered what she could from the forest during the warmer months: mushrooms, berries, herbs that she could sell or trade. She accepted charity when it was offered, swallowing her pride because her children's bellies were more important than her dignity. She did what countless poor widows have done throughout history. She survived, day by day, somehow, barely. Her cottage was small, just a single room really, with a sleeping loft where the children huddled together for warmth during the cold nights. The walls were chinked with mud and straw to keep out the wind, but the wind found ways through anyway, as it always does. There was a fireplace, but fuel was expensive, and she used it sparingly, banking the fire at night. teaching her children to wear layers, to huddle under the thin blankets she had managed to keep when everything else had been sold or traded away. The children, there were 3 of them in most versions of the story, though some say 4, some say 2, the number less important than their existence, were good children. They had learned early to be content with little, to not ask for things they knew their mother couldn't provide, to find joy in small pleasures, to help however they could. They gathered kindling. They drew water from the well. They looked after each other when their mother had to work. They were growing up fast, perhaps too fast, childhood compressed by necessity. As Christmas approached, the village began its preparations. Those who had a little extra would share with those who had less, as was the custom. The widow received a small sack of flour, some dried beans, a bit of salt pork, enough to make Christmas dinner, enough to celebrate in their own modest way. The children knew there would be no presents, no toys, no treats. They had long since learned not to expect such things. But there would be a meal, and they would be together, and their mother would smile in that way she had that tried so hard to hide her worry, and that would be enough. But the children had one wish, one hope they had spoken of in whispers when they thought their mother couldn't hear. They wished for a Christmas tree. In the village, families were bringing in their trees, decorating them with whatever they had. Through the windows of other cottages, the children had glimpsed candlelight reflecting off glass ornaments, had seen the greenery transformed into something magical. They didn't need ornaments, they told themselves. They didn't need candles, just the tree itself, just to have that piece of the forest, that symbol of life and hope, in their home on Christmas. The widow heard their whispers. She saw the longing in their eyes when they passed houses with trees glowing in the windows. And her heart broke, because this was such a simple thing, such a small wish, and yet she couldn't afford even this. There was no money for a tree. The forest where trees grew belonged to the landowner, and taking one without permission was theft, punishable by law. She could not risk it. She could not risk being caught, being fined, possibly imprisoned, leaving her children completely alone. But as Christmas Eve dawned cold and clear, as she prepared their modest meal and watched her children trying so hard to be happy, trying so hard not to show their disappointment, something shifted in her. Perhaps it was the mother's instinct to give her children something, anything, to make them smile. Perhaps it was a kind of defiance against the circumstances that had taken so much from them already. Perhaps it was simply love overcoming practicality. As dusk fell on Christmas Eve, she wrapped herself in her thin shawl and told the children she would return shortly. She walked to the edge of the forest, to where the land was less carefully watched, where smaller trees grew among the underbrush. She found one, a small pine, not much taller than herself, scraggly and imperfect, the kind of tree no one would pay money for, the kind that would never be missed. With her cold hands and the small knife she used for kitchen work, she cut it down. It took longer than it should have, her hands growing numb, her breath coming in clouds. But finally it fell, and she dragged it home through the snow. The children's faces when she came through the door, dragging that little tree, were worth every risk, every moment of cold, every splinter. Their eyes lit up with a joy so pure it almost hurt to witness. They helped her set it up in the corner of their single room, propping it in a bucket weighted with stones. It stood there, crooked and imperfect and completely bare, but to them it was beautiful. It was their tree. It was Christmas. The widow looked at the bare branches and felt the familiar pang of inadequacy. Other families had ornaments, decorations, beautiful things to hang on their trees. She had nothing, not even a single candle to place on its branches, because candles cost money they didn't have, and the one candle they owned was needed for light and couldn't be risked on decoration. "It's beautiful just as it is, Mama," one of the children said, sensing her distress, trying to comfort her the way she so often comforted them. "We don't need ornaments," another added. "We have the tree. That's enough." And the widow, blinking back tears, hugged her children and agreed that yes, it was enough. They had each other. They had a home, humble as it was. They had a tree, bare as it was. They had Christmas. It would be enough. That night, after their simple meal, after what meager celebration they could manage, the widow and her children said their prayers. They thanked God for what they had rather than lamenting what they lacked. They prayed for health, for spring to come, for better times ahead. And then they settled into sleep, the children in their loft, the widow by the dying fire. the little tree standing silent and dark in the corner. But they were not alone in the cottage. In the corners, in the spaces between the beams, behind the simple furniture, lived spiders. They had made their homes there, as spiders do, spinning their webs where they could catch the occasional fly or moth. They had watched the widow and her children. They had witnessed the poverty, the careful rationing, the quiet sacrifices. They had been there through the long, difficult months. They had seen everything. And on this Christmas Eve, as the family slept, the spiders came out. One by one, they descended from their hiding places. They approached the little tree standing bare in the corner, and they began to work. All through the night, while snow fell softly outside and the family slept peacefully inside, the spiders spun their webs. They worked with a purpose and dedication that went beyond instinct, as if guided by something greater than themselves. They climbed every branch, covered every needle, wove strands from trunk to tip. They created patterns of breathtaking intricacy, spirals and lacework, gossamer threads that crisscrossed and interconnected, transforming the simple pine tree into something extraordinary. By the time they finished, as the first hint of dawn began to brighten the eastern sky, the tree was completely covered in spider webs. Every branch, every twig, every needle was wrapped in silk. It was the spider's gift to this kind family who had never harmed them, who had let them live in the corners of the cottage, who had shared their home, humble as it was, with these small creatures. But the story doesn't end there, because as the first rays of Christmas morning sunlight touched the tree through the cottage's small window, something miraculous occurred. The spider webs began to transform. The silk, so delicate and gray in the darkness, caught the light and began to shimmer. And as the family watched in wonder, slowly waking to this impossible sight, the webs turned to silver. Pure, gleaming, radiant silver that sparkled and shone, catching and reflecting the light until the entire tree seemed to glow with an inner radiance. Some versions of the story say it was God who performed this transformation, looking down on this poor family and the spiders who had shown such kindness, and deciding to honor both with a miracle. Some say it was an angel passing by who touched the tree with divine grace. Some say it was the spirit of Christmas itself, that ineffable force of generosity and joy that transcends explanation. The mechanism matters less than the result. The widow woke first. She opened her eyes and saw the tree, and for a moment she couldn't process what she was seeing. The bare branches she had apologized for, the simple pine she had feared wasn't enough, had been transformed into something out of a dream. Every branch sparkled with silver. Every inch was covered in delicate, shimmering strands that caught the morning light and threw it back in 1,000 tiny stars. She woke the children, unable to find words, simply pointing to the tree. They climbed down from the loft, rubbing sleep from their eyes, and stood in stunned silence. Their tree, their simple tree that they had said was beautiful just as it was, had become more beautiful than anything they could have imagined. More beautiful than the decorated trees in the wealthy houses. More beautiful than anything they had ever seen. They approached it slowly, reverently, reaching out to touch the silver strands with gentle fingers. The web silk held, delicate but surprisingly strong, and the silver shone without tarnishing, without fading. It was real. It was truly real. The widow gathered her children close, and they stood together in front of their miraculous tree, and they understood, without anyone having to say it, that they had been given a gift that had nothing to do with money or material wealth. They had been given a sign that they were seen, that their struggles mattered, that their efforts to maintain gratitude and kindness despite their poverty had not gone unnoticed. They had been given a Christmas miracle. The story of the Christmas spider exists in many forms across Eastern Europe, and like all great folk tales, it adapted as it traveled, taking on the character and concerns of each culture that adopted it. These variations tell us something important about the story's core appeal. It was flexible enough to speak to different communities while maintaining its essential message. In Ukrainian traditions, the story is known as pavutchki, which means little spiders. The Ukrainian version often emphasizes the widow's industry and resourcefulness, qualities highly valued in Ukrainian culture where women were expected to manage households, often under difficult circumstances. The spiders in Ukrainian versions are sometimes described as having been blessed by Saint Nicholas, linking the folktale to Christian tradition. In some Ukrainian tellings, the silver webs become the family's salvation, not just spiritually, but practically. They're able to carefully harvest the silver, selling it to provide for themselves through the rest of the winter and beyond. This practical ending reflects the Ukrainian experience of poverty and survival. The miracle isn't just about beauty or wonder. It's about provision, about God or fate or fortune providing what is needed in unexpected ways. It's a deeply satisfying narrative for people who lived with constant economic uncertainty, who understood that survival often depended on recognizing and seizing opportunities when they appeared. In Poland, the story is sometimes called pajaki, again meaning spiders. The Polish versions often place more emphasis on the children's gratitude and their mother's sacrifice. There's frequently a moral dimension added, suggesting that the family receives this blessing because of their humility and contentment, because they were grateful for the simple tree rather than complaining about its bareness. This reflects Catholic teachings about humility and acceptance that were deeply embedded in Polish culture. Polish versions sometimes include details about the families sharing their miracle with the community, inviting neighbors to see the tree, which then becomes a source of joy for the entire village. This communal aspect is very Polish, reflecting the importance of community solidarity, especially during the partition era when Polish identity was maintained through cultural traditions rather than political independence. German versions of the story, particularly from eastern regions like Silesia and Prussia, sometimes frame it differently. In some German tellings, the spiders are explicitly sent by the Christ child, Christ guide, as a reward for the widow's faith and her kindness to all of God's creatures, including the spiders she allowed to live in her home. German Protestant traditions emphasize direct relationship with the divine, and this shows up in versions where the miracle is more clearly a divine intervention rather than a folk magic occurrence. The German versions also sometimes include more specific details about the family's poverty. The widow is often described as having been better off before her husband's death, having fallen from a more comfortable station. This class consciousness reflects the rigid social stratification of German society and makes the story partly about the randomness of fate and the importance of maintaining dignity regardless of circumstances. Czech and Slovak versions share similarities with the Polish and Ukrainian tellings, but often add elements about the spiders working in specific patterns, weaving symbols into their webs that have meaning. Sometimes religious symbols like crosses or stars, sometimes folk symbols related to protection and blessing. This reflects the Czech and Slovak folk traditions of symbolic art, where patterns and designs carried specific meanings. As the story spread westward and northward, adapted by German settlers and later picked up by Scandinavian communities, certain elements were softened or changed. The poverty was sometimes made less extreme. The widow sometimes gained a husband, becoming merely a poor family rather than a family headed by a single mother. These changes reflect cultural discomfort with certain realities, single mothers, extreme poverty, and a desire to make the story more respectable. Interestingly, when the story made its way to America with Eastern European immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it underwent further transformation. The poverty was often retained because immigrant communities understood poverty intimately. But the religious aspects were sometimes minimized because the story was being told in increasingly secular contexts. The miracle might be framed more as magic or folk enchantment rather than divine intervention. What's fascinating is what remained constant across all these variations. The bare tree, the widow or poor family, the spiders working through the night, the transformation to silver. These core elements persisted because they carried the essential meaning. Beauty and blessing can come from the most unexpected sources, and what seems like deprivation can be transformed into abundance. The story also persisted because it offered something that people needed, especially in the regions where it originated. Life in Eastern Europe during the centuries when this story flourished was often brutal. There were wars, so many wars. There were famines. There were epidemics. There were political upheavals that swept away entire ways of life. In this context, a story about unexpected grace, about making do with very little, about finding that your humble efforts are enough and might even be rewarded with miracles, was more than entertainment. It was sustenance for the spirit. The Christmas spider story also served a practical function in these communities. It explained and validated a real phenomenon. Spiders do spin webs on Christmas trees, especially in rural homes where spiders were a constant presence. Rather than seeing these webs as a sign of poor housekeeping or as something to be immediately swept away, the story transformed them into something meaningful, even lucky. Some families deliberately left corners of their homes uncleaned before Christmas, allowing spiders to remain undisturbed in hopes that they might bless the Christmas tree. Others would place small spider ornaments on their trees as a reminder of the story. These traditions created a tangible connection between the folk tale and lived experience, reinforcing the story's relevance. The story was typically told by grandmothers to grandchildren, passed down through the maternal line along with other domestic traditions and folk wisdom. This method of transmission gave the story a particular character. It was intimate, personal, connected to family and home rather than to formal education or religious instruction. It belonged to the domestic sphere, to women's knowledge, to the oral tradition that complemented but existed somewhat separately from written culture. In Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, variations of the story also existed, adapted to fit within Jewish cultural and religious frameworks. The widow might be explicitly identified as Jewish, and the miracle might be framed as occurring during Hanukkah rather than Christmas, or might be deliberately non-specific about timing. These Jewish versions show how powerful folk stories transcend religious boundaries, adapting to speak to universal human experiences while respecting different traditions. So how did a folk story about spiders and spider webs become connected to tinsel? The answer lies in the industrialization of Christmas that occurred during the 19th century, particularly in Germany, and the human impulse to recreate wonder through whatever means available. The custom of decorating Christmas trees became increasingly popular and elaborate during the Victorian era. What had been a relatively simple folk tradition, bringing an evergreen into the home, perhaps decorating it with natural items like nuts and apples, became increasingly ornate. The rising middle class wanted Christmas decorations that demonstrated their prosperity and good taste. An industry arose to meet this demand. Germany was at the center of this Christmas industry. German craftsmen were producing glass ornaments, intricate wooden figures, elaborate nativity scenes. The German Christmas market became renowned throughout Europe, and German manufacturers, always looking for new products to sell, began experimenting with ways to capture the sparkle and shimmer that people associated with a truly magical Christmas tree. According to tradition, German manufacturers in Nuremberg heard the old story of the Christmas spider, by this time a well-known folk tale throughout German-speaking regions. They recognized that people loved the idea of the silver webs, but real spider webs on a tree, even if people welcomed them in folk tradition, were not practical for the increasingly formal, middle-class Christmas celebrations. So they began to create artificial versions. The earliest tinsel was made of real silver, thin strips beaten flat and cut into strands. This silver tinsel was expensive, affordable only to the wealthy, but it caught on immediately. It shimmered and sparkled exactly like the silver webs in the story. It transformed ordinary trees into something magical, something that captured the wonder of the folk tale. The production of silver tinsel became a cottage industry in parts of Germany. Families would work together beating silver into thin sheets, cutting it into strands, packaging it for sale. It was labor-intensive work, but the demand was strong. Christmas trees decorated with silver tinsel became a sign of elegance and celebration. However, real silver tarnishes. It's heavy, pulling down branches, and it was expensive enough that many families couldn't afford it. Manufacturers began looking for alternatives. They experimented with different metals and alloys. Eventually, they developed tinsel made from other materials, tin, aluminum, later plastic, that could mimic the appearance of silver at a fraction of the cost. By the late 19th century, tinsel had become widely available. German immigrants brought the tradition to America, where it was enthusiastically adopted. Christmas catalogs from the early 20th century show tinsel being sold by the box, with instructions for how to drape it artistically over tree branches to create the maximum shimmer and sparkle. Interestingly, the marketing of tinsel often explicitly referenced the Christmas spider story, at least in early years. Advertisements would mention the old German legend of spider webs turning to silver positioning tinsel as a way to bring this fairy tale magic into your own home. The story gave the product a romantic backstory, the sense of tradition and meaning beyond mere decoration. But as tinsel became ubiquitous, as it shifted from being a special purchase to being a standard, cheap component of Christmas decoration, the story behind it was gradually forgotten. By the mid-20th century, most people hanging tinsel on their trees had no idea why they were doing it, what it was meant to represent, what story it was connected to. It had become divorced from its origin, just another shiny thing, something you put on a Christmas tree because that's what you do. The loss of the story represents a broader pattern in how Christmas became commercialized and standardized during the 20th century. Traditions that had deep roots in folk culture, that carried specific meanings and stories, were simplified and mass-produced until only the outer form remained. The shell of the tradition persisted while the meaning drained away. There's something poignant about this. The Christmas spider story is fundamentally about poverty, about making do with very little, about finding that your humble efforts are enough. Tinsel, especially in its modern plastic form, is about abundance, about decoration for decoration's sake, about having so much that you can literally throw it away after a single season. The commercial product contradicts the spirit of the story that inspired it. Yet, even in its commercialized form, tinsel retains something of the original magic. There's still something special about the way it catches light, the way it transforms an ordinary tree into something that sparkles and shimmers. Children still delight in it. Adults still take time to drape it carefully, trying to achieve that perfect shimmer. In some unconscious way, we're still trying to recreate that moment from the old story, that Christmas morning when the widow and her children woke to find their bare tree transformed into something glorious. In recent decades, there's been a small revival of interest in the Christmas spider story. Folk art enthusiasts have created spider ornaments based on traditional designs. Some families have deliberately incorporated the story into their Christmas traditions, telling it to their children, explaining the meaning behind the tinsel. There's a hunger for stories, for meaning, for connection to something deeper than the commercial surface of modern Christmas. Some churches, particularly those with Eastern European congregations, have revived the practice of including the Christmas spider story in their holiday services or church school programs. It's a way of maintaining cultural heritage, of passing on traditions that might otherwise be lost, of reminding people that Christmas has roots in folk culture and human experience, not just in shopping malls and advertising campaigns. There are also people who have created their own rituals around the story. Some deliberately hang tinsel while telling the tale, making the act of decoration into a teaching moment. Some place a special spider ornament at the top or center of their tree as a reminder. Some even welcome real spiders on their trees, allowing nature to create its own decorations in keeping with the spirit of the original story. These small acts of cultural preservation and personal meaning-making are important. They represent a pushback against the homogenization and commercialization of Christmas. They insist that traditions can have depth, that decorations can mean something, that even in our modern, secular age, we can create and maintain connections to older stories and deeper truths. Like all enduring folk tales, the Christmas spider story operates on multiple levels. On the surface, it's a simple story about a poor family and a Christmas miracle. But beneath that surface lie layers of meaning that speak to fundamental human experiences and values. At its most obvious level, the story is about poverty and the fear of not being able to provide for one's children. The widow's distress over the bare tree, her desperate trip to the forest, her sadness that she can't give her children even this simple thing. These emotions are universal among parents who struggle financially. Anyone who has ever looked at their children and felt the pain of not being able to give them what they need, what they want, what other children seem to have effortlessly, understands the widow's heartache. But the story offers comfort to this fear. It says that your efforts, however humble, are enough. The tree didn't need to be perfect. It didn't need ornaments bought from a shop. The widow's willingness to try, to risk, to give what little she could, was what mattered. And somehow, mysteriously, that was enough to open the door to blessing. This is a deeply reassuring message for anyone struggling with scarcity. You don't have to provide everything. You don't have to match what others can give. You just have to give what you can with love, and somehow they will be transformed into something sufficient, maybe even something beautiful. The story is also about gratitude and contentment. The children's response to the bear tree is crucial. They say it's beautiful just as it is. They don't complain about the lack of ornaments. They don't compare their tree unfavorably to others. They find joy in what they have rather than mourning what they lack. This attitude of gratitude is what opens them to recognize and appreciate the miracle when it comes. There's a spiritual dimension here that transcends any particular religious tradition. It's the insight that abundance is partly a matter of perception, that we can choose to see what we have rather than what we lack, that this choice affects not just our happiness, but our entire experience of reality. The children teach their mother this lesson, even as she's trying to provide for them. The spiders represent several things simultaneously. On one level, they're the least of creatures, small and humble, often overlooked or even despised. Their presence in the story reminds us that help and blessing can come from the most unexpected sources, that we shouldn't dismiss or disregard anything as too small or insignificant to matter. The spiders also represent industry, patience, and creativity. They work through the night, creating something of beauty through their own labor, asking nothing in return. There's also something profound in the fact that the spiders were already there, living in the cottage, sharing the space with the family. The blessing doesn't come from outside, from some distant source. It comes from creatures who were already part of the family's daily life, who they had been living alongside without really noticing. This suggests that grace is often closer than we think, that miracles might emerge from the ordinary circumstances of our lives if we have eyes to see them. The transformation of the wedge from gray silk to gleaming silver is perhaps the story's most powerful symbol. It represents transfiguration, the mysterious process by which the ordinary becomes extraordinary, the humble becomes glorious. The spiders didn't spin silver, they spun ordinary spider silk, doing what spiders naturally do. But that ordinary work, that natural expression of their being, was transformed into something precious by forces beyond understanding. This speaks to a deep human hope, that our ordinary efforts, our daily work, our small acts of kindness and creativity might be worth more than they seem. That there might be a kind of alchemy by which the humble offerings we make with sincere hearts become something greater. That we don't need to do spectacular things. We just need to do what we can, as well as we can, and trust that it matters more than we know. The timing of the miracle is also significant. It happens on Christmas Eve while the family sleeps. They don't witness the work being done. They don't see the transformation occurring. They simply wait to find it accomplished. This reinforces the idea that grace operates mysteriously, that we can't control or manipulate blessing, that some gifts come only when we're not striving for them, when we've done what we can and then let go. There's also something important in the fact that the spiders work collectively. It's not a single spider creating a single beautiful web. It's many spiders working together, each contributing to the whole. This reflects the communal nature of Eastern European village life, where survival depended on mutual aid, on everyone contributing what they could to the common good. The miracle is a community effort, even if that community consists of small creatures working in the darkness. The silver itself carries symbolic weight. Silver has been valued across cultures not just for its beauty, but for its associations with purity, moon, light, and divine presence. In folk traditions, silver was believed to have protective properties, to ward off evil spirits and bring good fortune. So the transformation to silver isn't just about making the tree pretty. It's about blessing, protection, and the presence of something holy. From a feminist perspective, the story is notable for centering on a woman's experience and a woman's agency. The widow is not waiting for a man to rescue her or solve her problems. She's not passive or helpless. She makes the difficult decision to take the tree. She brings it home. She provides for her family however she can. The miracle that follows doesn't replace her agency. It honors and amplifies it. Her efforts are validated, not dismissed as unnecessary because magic intervened. The story also validates domestic space and domestic labor. The miracle happens in the home, in the private sphere traditionally associated with women. The spiders live in the corners of the cottage, in the spaces between domestic order and wild nature. The blessing transforms domestic space into sacred space, suggesting that the home, the daily work of maintaining life and caring for children, is itself worthy of miracle and attention. There's a thread here about acceptance and allowing. The widow allowed spiders to live in her home. She didn't wage constant war against them, didn't obsessively clean every corner. She accepted their presence as part of the natural order. And this acceptance created the conditions for blessing. There's a lesson here about control and the illusion of it, about how constantly trying to eliminate every bit of wildness and unpredictability from our lives might actually close us off from unexpected gifts. The bare tree, too, has its own symbolic resonance. In its bareness, it's honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. It stands in its essential nature, just a pine tree, nothing added, nothing false. And it's precisely this honesty, this acceptance of its own nature, that makes it ready to receive transformation. There's something here about authenticity, about showing up as we truly are rather than trying to create an impressive facade. For children hearing this story, it offers multiple lessons. It teaches empathy for those who have less. It demonstrates that attitude matters more than possessions. It shows that beauty can emerge from unexpected places. It validates the feelings of disappointment that come with scarcity, while also offering hope that things can change. It encourages kindness to small creatures and attention to the natural world. For adults, especially those struggling with their own versions of the widow's poverty, whether material poverty or poverty of spirit, poverty of time, poverty of resources, the story offers profound comfort. It says that doing your best is enough, that you don't have to be able to provide everything to be a good parent, a good person, that sometimes grace intervenes in ways we can't predict or control, and our job is simply to remain open to recognizing it when it comes. The story also speaks to the experience of immigrants and displaced peoples, which is particularly relevant given its Eastern European origins. So many families fled those regions during times of war, persecution, famine, political upheaval. They carried little with them, often arriving in new lands with almost nothing. The story traveled with them because it spoke to their experience. We have little, but we have each other. We have our traditions, we have hope, and somehow there will be enough. Somehow, in ways we can't foresee, blessings will come. There's also an ecological dimension to the story that feels particularly relevant today. The spiders are part of the ecosystem of the home, playing their role in the web of life. The tree is brought in from the forest, a piece of nature welcomed into human space. The miracle occurs when human and non-human worlds interact with mutual respect. This stands in stark contrast to our modern tendency to see nature as something to be controlled, exploited, or kept entirely separate from our living spaces. The story suggests a different relationship with the natural world, one where we recognize ourselves as part of nature rather than apart from it, where small creatures are neighbors worthy of respect, where bringing the forest into our homes is not just decoration, but a way of maintaining connection to something essential. In our age of environmental crisis, of disconnection from nature, of climate change driven by seeing the earth as merely a resource to be extracted, the Christmas spider story offers an alternative vision. To fully appreciate how remarkable it is that this story has survived, we need to understand what it survived. The regions where this story originated have been through centuries of upheaval that would have destroyed less resilient traditions. The Eastern European territories where the Christmas spider story flourished were contested ground for centuries. Empires rose and fell. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Wars swept across these lands repeatedly. The Mongol invasions, the Crusades, the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, all left their marks on these regions and their people. In such times, folk traditions were one of the few forms of cultural continuity available to people who had little control over larger political and military events. Stories, songs, traditions passed down within families became ways of maintaining identity, of remembering who you were and where you came from even as the world around you changed dramatically. The Christmas spider story persisted through the medieval period, when Christmas itself was a complex blend of Christian and pre-Christian traditions. It survived the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which could have eliminated folk traditions seen as too pagan or not sufficiently orthodox. It adapted, taking on more explicitly Christian elements in some versions, remaining more folksy and magical than others, flexible enough to survive in different religious contexts. The story survived the great famines that periodically devastated these regions. In fact, it may have become more meaningful during such times, when real poverty and hunger were widespread, when every family knew what it meant to have almost nothing. A story about a poor family receiving unexpected blessing would have resonated deeply. It offered hope when hope was scarce. The industrialization of the 19th century could have destroyed the story as traditional village life broke down and people moved to cities for factory work. But instead, the story adapted, becoming associated with the commercialized Christmas tree tradition, getting encoded into the production of tinsel. This adaptation, while it eventually led to the story being forgotten by many, actually helped it survive the transition from traditional to modern society. The story survived the World Wars, which devastated Eastern Europe beyond imagination. World War I saw massive displacement of populations, redrawing of borders, destruction of communities. World War II was even worse, particularly in these regions which saw some of the most intense fighting and suffering of the war. The Holocaust destroyed entire Jewish communities that had maintained their own versions of Christmas and winter blessing stories. The Soviet occupation that followed brought deliberate suppression of folk traditions and religious practices. Yet the story persisted. Grandmothers continued to tell it to grandchildren. Families that fled to the West brought it with them. Even in Soviet-controlled territories, the story survived in the private sphere, told quietly within families, part of the resistance to cultural erasure. The great immigrations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries carried the story around the world. Eastern European immigrants to America, Canada, Australia, South America brought their traditions with them, including this story. It was told in Polish, Ukrainian, German, Czech, and eventually in English and other languages as subsequent generations adopted the languages of their new homes. In America, the story found new life in ethnic communities that clustered in certain neighborhoods and maintained old country traditions. Churches serving these communities became repositories of cultural memory, places where the old stories could be told, where ethnic identity could be preserved and passed on. Christmas celebrations in these communities deliberately incorporated traditions from the homeland, and the Christmas spider story was often part of that. The story also found its way into American popular culture in small ways. Some women's magazines in the early 20th century published versions of it, sometimes as quaint foreign customs, sometimes as charming Christmas content. Folk art enthusiasts collected versions of the story and the traditional spider ornaments. And of course, the mass production of tinsel kept the physical tradition alive even as knowledge of its origin faded. What's remarkable is that the story survived it all. Folk tales are fragile. They exist in memory and in retelling. If a generation fails to pass them on, they can disappear forever. The Christmas spider story could have been lost dozens of times during wars, migrations, the shift from rural to urban life, the assimilation of immigrant communities into mainstream culture. But something about the story kept people telling it, perhaps because it speaks to experiences that remain relevant. Poverty, parenthood, the desire to give our children good things, the fear that what we have isn't enough, the hope for unexpected grace. Perhaps because the image of the silver webs is so beautiful, so memorable, that once you've heard it described, you want to pass it on. Perhaps because in an increasingly commercial Christmas, there's hunger for stories that carry meaning, that connect to something deeper than shopping and consumption. So what can this old story, born in a different time and place, offer to us today? What wisdom does the Christmas spider carry for our modern lives? First, and most obviously, it offers perspective on materialism and our consumer culture. We live in a time of unprecedented material abundance, at least for many of us in developed nations. Yet somehow, Christmas has become increasingly about stress. Stress about buying the right gifts, spending enough money, creating the perfect celebration, measuring up to social media-worthy standards. The Christmas spider story reminds us that the widow's children were happy with just a tree. They didn't need expensive ornaments. They found joy in something simple because they approached it with gratitude rather than expectation. When the miracle came, it was all the more wondrous because they had already learned to appreciate what they had. How many of us could benefit from this lesson? How often do we spend money we don't really have? stress ourselves trying to create elaborate celebrations, feel inadequate because we can't match what others seem to achieve, all while missing the simple joys that are already present. The story invites us to ask, what if we approached our holidays with the children's attitude of gratitude? What if we decided that what we have is enough? The story also speaks to the experience of economic hardship, which remains relevant despite our overall material abundance. Poverty hasn't disappeared. Many families struggle to provide basics, let alone holiday luxuries. Many parents lie awake worrying about how to give their children a good Christmas on a limited budget. The Christmas Spider story offers these families something precious: validation and hope. It validates the struggle. It acknowledges that poverty is painful, that wanting to give your children more than you can provide hurts, that there's no shame in having little. The widow isn't blamed for her poverty. She's not told she should have made better choices or worked harder. Her circumstances are simply presented as reality, and her pain over them is honored as legitimate. And it offers hope, not the false promise that money will magically appear, but the deeper hope that what you can give, given with love, is sufficient. That your children can learn joy and gratitude even in scarcity. That somehow, in ways you can't predict, there will be grace sufficient for your needs. This is hope that doesn't require ignoring reality, hope that can coexist with difficulty. The story also teaches about noticing and appreciating the small things, the overlooked things. The spiders lived in the cottage all along, but they were invisible until the night they chose to reveal their gift. How much do we miss because we're not paying attention? How many small graces pass unnoticed because we're focused on what we lack rather than what we have? This isn't about toxic positivity or pretending everything is fine when it's not. It's about the practice of attention, of noticing. The widow noticed her children's longing for a tree. The children noticed their mother's sacrifice in getting it. And on Christmas morning, they all noticed the miracle. This quality of attention, of really seeing what's in front of us, is a skill we can develop, and it transforms our experience of life. The story's message about accepting help from unexpected sources feels particularly relevant today. We often have rigid ideas about where help should come from, what forms it should take. We might wait for help from traditional sources while missing the assistance being offered from unexpected directions. The widow wasn't expecting spiders to solve her problem. She might have swept away their webs on an ordinary day, but she had created, perhaps without realizing it, conditions that allowed blessing to emerge from an unlikely source. This suggests we should remain open to possibility, to surprise, to grace arriving in forms we didn't anticipate. It also suggests that the small things we do, allowing spiders to live in our corners, being kind to small creatures, maintaining gratitude despite difficulty, might create conditions for unexpected blessing in ways we can't predict or control. The story also models healthy parent-child relationships. The widow tries to provide for her children, but she doesn't pretend their situation is other than it is. The children respond with gratitude rather than demanding more. There's honesty in their family, combined with love and mutual support. In our age of helicopter parenting and intense pressure to give children every advantage, there's something refreshing about this simpler model. The children in the story aren't sheltered from the reality of their poverty. They know they're poor. They know there are things they can't have. But this knowledge doesn't destroy them or embitter them. Instead, it teaches them gratitude, resilience, the ability to find joy in simple things. These are gifts, arguably more valuable than material abundance, that will serve them throughout their lives. For those of us who are older, who remember different times, the Christmas Spider story offers a connection to a slower, simpler approach to Christmas. It reminds us that holidays don't have to be frantic or commercial or stressful, that the point is connection, gratitude, wonder, attention to what matters, that sometimes the best celebrations are the simplest ones. And for all of us, regardless of our circumstances, the story offers the possibility of enchantment. We live in a disenchanted age, where mystery has been explained away, where magic is dismissed as childish fantasy, where everything must be rational and measurable. But humans need enchantment. We need beauty that takes our breath away. We need stories that suggest the world is more wonderful than it seems. We need to believe in the possibility of transformation, of grace, of miracles. The Christmas Spider story offers this without requiring us to abandon reason or deny reality. It's a story, yes, but it's a story that points to real truths about human experience, about how beauty emerges, about how grace operates, about how the ordinary can become extraordinary. We can hold the story as story while still receiving what it offers. The sense that the world is enchanted after all, that mystery remains, that there's more going on than what we can see and measure and control. As we come to the end of our journey through this forgotten tale, I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine that this Christmas, as you stand before your tree with strands of tinsel in your hands, you pause for a moment. You remember the story of the widow and her children, the bare tree, the spiders working through the night, the miracle of silver webs on Christmas morning. And imagine that as you drape those silver strands over the branches, you're not just decorating. You're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries, that connects you to countless families across time and space who have told this story, who have hung their own versions of tinsel, who have searched for beauty and meaning in the midst of their own struggles. Imagine that each strand of tinsel is a prayer, a hope, a reminder. A prayer for those who struggle with poverty and scarcity. A hope that our small efforts, our humble offerings, will be enough. A reminder that grace comes from unexpected places, that miracles happen, that beauty emerges from the most unlikely sources. The Christmas spider story has survived wars and migrations, poverty and persecution, centuries of change and upheaval. It has survived because it carries something essential, something we need. The promise that our humble efforts matter, that what we can give is enough, that grace arrives in surprising ways to those who maintain gratitude and kindness despite hardship. In our modern world, with all its complexity and stress, with its commercial pressures and material abundance that somehow never quite satisfies, this old story offers something precious. It offers simplicity. It offers perspective. It offers the reminder that Christmas, the real heart of it, the meaning beneath all the trappings, is about light and darkness, about hope in difficult times, about unexpected blessing, about finding that what seems like too little is somehow enough. So this Christmas, perhaps you'll share this story with someone. Perhaps you'll tell it to your children or grandchildren, adding your voice to the chain of voices that have passed this tale down through the generations. Perhaps you'll share it with friends who are struggling, who need to hear that their efforts are sufficient, that grace is closer than they think. Or perhaps you'll simply hold it quietly in your own heart as you go through your holiday preparations. When the stress builds, when the to-do lists seem overwhelming, when you worry that what you can provide isn't enough, remember the widow and her bare tree. Remember that the children found joy before the miracle came, that their gratitude opened them to recognize blessing when it arrived. Remember the spiders, working patiently through the night, each one contributing what it could, creating something beautiful together. Remember that your efforts, however humble, matter more than you know. Remember that grace operates mysteriously, that transformation happens in ways we can't predict or control, that sometimes we simply need to do what we can and then rest, trusting that it will be enough. As you hang your tinsel this year, let each silver strand remind you, you are part of a story much larger and older than yourself. You are connected to all the families across centuries who have celebrated Christmas with whatever they had, who have found ways to create light and warmth and beauty despite hardship. You are part of the human family, the human story, the endless cycle of struggle and grace, of darkness and light, of making do and discovering that somehow, mysteriously, it's enough. And who knows? Perhaps if we approach our holidays with the spirit of the widow and her children, with gratitude for what we have, with efforts given honestly from whatever resources we possess, with openness to grace from unexpected sources, perhaps we too will wake one morning to find that what seemed too little has been transformed into something wondrous. The spiders are still weaving, friends, quietly, patiently, in the corners and shadows, in the overlooked spaces of our lives. They're creating beauty from simple materials, working while we sleep, asking nothing in return. And sometimes, if we're lucky, if we're paying attention, if we've maintained kindness and gratitude despite our struggles, we wake to find that their work has been transformed into something silver, something that catches the light and throws it back in 1,000 tiny stars, something that makes us catch our breath and remember. The world is still enchanted. Miracles still happen. Grace still arrives unbidden. And sometimes, the humblest creatures bring the greatest gifts. May your Christmas be blessed. May your tree shimmer with silver. And may you recognize the spider's work when you see it. In your life, in your home, in the unexpected places where grace appears, quietly transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary, the humble into the holy, the bare branches into something that catches the light and shines. Merry Christmas, and may the legend of the Christmas spider live on in your heart and in the hearts of those you love for generations to come.